So I'm a strategic advisor for my own company, which is called Curious Altitudes. And curious and perspective, so altitude is two things that potentially really help us to get through that change. And we're all living through change right now, right? You can feel it. Everything is moving really fast. Everything is crazy, news coming from everywhere. So the question is, how do we react to that? So I want to try to give a perspective and really make sense of the complexity that we're all witnessing, especially in your roles as a PMM. And I think there's a perspective here that I brought to the table, which I call the power of narrative. So narrative is something that, once you're a little bit clear around the positioning, the word of narrative, there's power in it. And I want to bring that to you. And we look at really today at the infrastructure, how to build that narrative, and the architecture. And I will say there's a white space, and there's an opportunity here that has not been unlocked. And having worked in organizations for so many years, I think there's something of a role that needs to be rewritten for the PMMs, and there's an opportunity space here for the industry, for you all. Let's dive in. What is a narrative? You might be thinking, oh, that's storytelling. We all do storytelling. That all makes sense. It's an old book. We all got that covered. No, narrative isn't just storytelling. It's really a process of identity and sense-making. And we've seen, a lot of these things like average, the numbers that we've just seen. It's like, does that all make sense? Is there a red thread, for example, in what we're doing on the GTM side and so on? So a narrative is trying to spin that red thread of really, really making sense of actually what we're doing. And it's a process of how we as people know who we are, what we do. We understand how to locate us in all the process. It's a way we actually create meaning, right? And coherence out of this really big complexity. And our jobs are very complex, right? So how can a narrative be this correct connective tissue that turns our individual truths that we all see into really a collective story? And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. Hold this for a moment. So this is the Monday morning moment, and I've lived through a lot of these Monday mornings, and they looked like this. You walked into the room, and then, you have 17 different narratives starting talking to you. It's like, we stand for this, we should be doing this, the GTM goes like this, and the direction's over here. And then leadership is looking at you and looking at the group and is asking, why is the quarter off? I don't understand what's happening to the numbers. And then everybody turns around in the room and looks at you and stares at you, and you're like, what the fuck? What's just happened? What is going on? So who can relate to that Monday morning meeting? Who has been in this room and have seen these stories and these different narratives hitting each other? Yes. So this misalignment that you see in an organization is actually costing you a lot of money. And we talked about speed earlier, but if we're not aligned, we see big numbers on the table. This is the sales marketing misalignment globally, B2B. If we are talking, we're not effective in what we're doing, there's revenue also disappearing. But on the right side, you see a number which is like, hey, when you're in the move, when you're in the flow, you actually see uptake. You are seeing a revenue impact. You're seeing that teams are moving in cohesion. So, and you all know that feeling when something is really going into a flow, when you're really hitting and you're working as a unit. And it shows up in the numbers. So why is this so important right now? Why is this misalignment and getting an alignment and really structuring a more cohesive narrative moving forward really, really matters? There is really economic pressure on one side. We know that AI is moving and changing everything right now and accelerating a lot. We heard about budgets. We heard about budget shrinking and the pressure of doing more. We see that buyers are getting smarter, more informed than ever, and we are seeing that leaders and people are moving on quicker. So we need to find a different system that actually sticks moving forward. So what I'm here to talk to you about today is, I think we have a gap in the system, and that's missing. One, I think there is a role for the PMM in the future that we could own, and there's a method really to build it. So the framework, how do we think about moving that into action, which is so important, right? And let's talk about two kinds of growth, right? You see that on the right side. This is your right side, yes, the optimization, right? We've all lived this, right? So better funnels, better playbooks. We see more features and bigger campaigns, and the metrics is. But there's a certain kind of threshold that you can potentially reach. And then on the other side, you see, on this side, you see the systemic growth. And what do I mean with this? This is about a connected system. This is about having a strategy in order to really have the freedom to execute in a wider scale. And we talked about the compounding moment. We talked about the writer a little bit earlier, right? So the additive moment when you do things more steady. There's a compounding moment when you are more systematic in the things you're doing. And there's something around a sustainable advantage. And I call that whole thing, the systematic growth, the architecture expansion. So my belief is you all don't have a messaging problem. I think you all have, or we all have, an architectural problem. And what do I mean with this? So when companies want to grow, most leaders call for a decorator. But what they actually need is an architect, someone with perspective, someone who builds. And what do I mean with this? The decorator. Let's talk about the decorator for a moment. The decorator is awesome. He puts, or she puts, fresh paint on things. You all know potentially the expression like, put lipstick on a pig. I had to do it many times. It's like something that comes onto my table and like, you're in marketing, make it pretty, right? So put just a little bit of lipstick on it and then it should work. So new campaigns, quick fixes, GTM after GTM, and follow that kind of like industry-wide playbooks that we all share with each other and we all know. So what does an architect actually do, and what's the shift? Is there's a foundation design. There's something that is building a structure that scales, and something that is very to the heart of mine, and you heard it with narrative power, but something that unifies and enables through a storyline that really holds. So we will talk a little bit more about integration and system building, but also the architect understands market nuances, understands what is needed. And if you look how you go to market potentially now, is like how much of market nuances are being taken care of. In my cases, many times it's like all globally, we're all the same. Well, we're not. So decorators, they make things look really awesome, right? It looks pretty, it looks great. But architects, they are actually making things hold. And here's the missing layer that I believe we're seeing. One, you see the strategy, the C-suite, they're coming up with vision, goals, all the great product roadmaps, and the strategic intent. And you've seen that they all have these amazing ideas and so on, but then you put this story into what I maybe call a little bit of the sausage factory, right? You put it into the organization, and you see suddenly how complex this is. And just about, on the right side down here, just 14 people have 91 lines of communication. So now imagine the complexity if you don't have that architecture, if you don't have that story straight, if you don't know, if there's something a little off that people don't understand, then it gets really, really complicated. And what you see is, and you all live this, right? Things and ideas come down the line, and then they go into the different departments. They go into this, and then suddenly it just gets really messy. And then suddenly the GTM is delayed, suddenly the product pipeline is off, and so on. And it gets very, very complex. So what's the gap? How do we fix this? How do we make this maybe a little bit better? I think the gap is the unclear bridge between the vision, and the action, and the execution. And you see two camps of the organizations, like either you stay up here or you have the execution, and somehow in between it's very, very messy. And I think how we can fix it is what I call the narrative architecture. And what do I mean with this? So what is the architecture that helps? And if you look at the literature that we're all reading and the theory that PMMs are working on, is that we're kind of missing that connective blueprint. So you see, we have a lot of work on positioning and statements. We've seen a lot of people thinking about strategic product narratives and how to do the messaging and all of this. And then we have messaging executions and pipelines. But what's missing is that in between. So how do we build that blueprint? How do we build that infrastructure that really makes narrative systematically operational? And here's the catch. This is where I see the PMMs taking more shape, getting more budgets in the future, right? So this is the PMMs white space. And the interesting thing, though, is nobody's ever teaching you or us how to do it. So there is not a class that says, here's how you build the narrative, the through line. This is your playbook. We have playbooks for certain kinds of situations, but how to really move an organization into a cohesive direction is a challenge and a gap and an opportunity. And I had to bring Richard, right? So Richard is saying, we all know this, but I think it's a great reminder. If you don't teach new marketers the why behind everything they're doing, you're not preparing them. And what I'm saying and telling you is you start with the why. Of course, it's Simon Sinek, but it's we keep forgetting the why. And once you start from there, everything lines up, and the architecture is lining up. It sounds simple. It's very complicated, we know, but I'm going to talk about the framework, how to get there. So for the room, this is really not about doing more. We already have a shitload on our plates, right? So this is about that missing layer. And I think there was a question earlier, how do we get a seat at the table? And I think it's really about claiming the role you always meant to be holding. And this is how you earn a seat at the table, right? And I'm going to show you a little bit the shift to that seat. So there's a shift from the executor, everything that we're comfortable in doing, we know what we're doing, to what I called earlier the architect, and everything that I just said earlier. So it is the role of structuring that cohesive storyline, that narrative architect, the infrastructure builder. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the three ingredients of what I call narrative infrastructure. So how do you implement this into an organization? What's the role? What's the framework? What's the ingredients you all need or can take to earn that seat at the table as things are shifting, as things are changing, as organizations looking for more effectiveness and less misalignment? So you see three areas here. One is what I call the business stack. Is that structure that connects meaning and impact. We talked about business numbers, business goals. All of this is in here. We talked about the leadership skills, and we heard them in the statistics a little bit earlier. So the leadership capacity, I call, that holds that system together. What is the skill set we need in order to build that kind of infrastructure? And then how do you build that architecture? How do you move that? And there are what I call architectural moves. So very concrete steps. I have 4 steps based out of the learnings with many organizations that we put together and I put together to think about how do we get that into a framework of action and really build that method. So I'm going to bring this to you as a thought starter. So the business stack is here. This is the first layer, right? So this is what we know. and the PMMs know by heart is, really think of the company like a building. This is the business model. It's the foundation. So when we build that building, that business model is really the ground we're all working and standing on. And then the user needs, the customer needs, are really what I would call the pillars on the side, right? The go-to-market is the framing, right? So that it looks like a great frame. And the brand story, that expression, is what really all ties it together, gives it a shape and form and kind of, how it all looks. But this is the business stack. Now, when you think about your company right now, do you have all these lined up? When you think about your business model, your user needs, your go-to-market, are you asking the right questions? Do you have your brand story straight? Is it all connected? Right? So that would be the first part. We talked a little bit about skill set. What do you need to bring to the table in the future, or already have to bring to the table right now? We see that the PMM role is, a pretty gray space in many areas. And the question is what I would call this next level leadership, the leadership capacity that is so important to bring to organizations. It's what I potentially would also say is the human architecture that holds it all together. So think about the skill set that it's needed to really bring stories to life and stories into organizations. So on top is influence and power. How do you influence? How do you really understand power dynamics in organizations? The second one is how do you navigate in organizations? Learning how to navigate is hard the bigger the organization is. And then there's, you create spaces in organizations. You need to be a facilitator. You need to integrate different perspectives. And because the job is also tough, right? There's some sort of resilience that you need to bring to the table because it comes with a lot of frustration. So the question is, how do you deal with that resilience? And the last point, which I think is underestimated, but I certainly think is important, is taking people along the journey by listening to them and coaching them through that change process. So think about your coaching skills, think about your resilience, and think about your influencing skills and how you can bring them to the table as part of that architecture. And here are the 4 moves to bring this all to life. We have the business stack, we have the leadership skill set, and the question is how you build that architecture, how do you build that change? And everybody who knows me and who's ever worked with me is that the number 1 word for me is always locate, locate, locate. I'm using this a lot of times, and it's kind of annoying, but when everybody runs around and has different stories and different things, and you see your team is in disarray, and everybody is chaotic and or in panic and in fear, I said, time out. I'm like a football coach. Stop. Everybody come together. Let's locate where we are individually, as a group, as a company. What the hell are we doing? And then listen. And then from that listening is really what I would call mapping what exists, also the mess. I think that's very important because we all tend to be celebrating all the successes, but we need to be really, really clear also about the gaps that we're seeing and also the metrics that define the success. And once you understand where everyone is, when the storylines that we all see in the organization, then you can start designing. Then you can start owning that narrative. Then you can design the architecture, the system, and that connective tissue that connects all the things. And I'm going to show you an example in a second. And when you have that design, you can build that compass. And what I mean with compass is you have something that you can actually guide you into the future, understands how decisions in organizations are being made. And then you can let everyone swim. You can start swimming, which means it's fun. You have the structure, you know where you're going, the teams are aligned, the story is straight, the narrative is there. you can then execute at speed and scale, and potentially without fear. Now, that's, let's say, the best case scenario, and we know there's a lot of complexity in this, but let me take you through my personal story and experience around how I use this methodology in my life. So let's locate. So I started working for Mozilla after I ran go-to-market and marketing communications for a long time at ASICS. Also, I was in agency side before, but then Mozilla called, and they were like, we want to build something in Europe. We have momentum with users, but we have no idea what to do. So, Robin, why don't you come in and be our first representative from a marketing side to really look at Europe? So this is what I got when I walked in. I'm like, oh my God, what have I done? There was no really clear narrative architecture. There was no architect, there was no blueprint. And we're an American-based company in Silicon Valley. And the engineers on one side were like, oh, we need to talk about browser performance. That's the most important thing. And then we had policy, and they were like, privacy, this is very important for Mozilla, right? So let's talk about this. And the marketing is like, well, the product wants us to talk about features. But, people on browsers potentially don't want to hear more features, right? It's a segment of that. So we had 10 teams, 10 different narratives, no system. There was really not a misalignment on tactics. There were different roles. It was quite challenging to really start something from scratch. And with that in mind, I really started to map that mess and brought it back to the organization and really did that location exercise. And what came out of that, and this sounds very simple right now, but it's been a long process, is really landing that space, what we called the freedom of choice. So this is a narrative structure that we created, simple words, but it gave meaning. So it resonated with the organization, particularly in Europe, because it was human. And it felt, most people felt trapped by the defaults of big technology, right? And they wanted their agency back. So they wanted choice. And it really became something that's executionable. So, and product could build really features around it. So freedom of choice, everybody became suddenly meaningful. And we really designed one narrative stack. And this is what I showed you earlier out of this. So really just a one-pager that gave everyone a clear storyline, a narrative to look into. So ranging from the purpose, why we exist, we believe Firefox exists for user agency. There's a problem that big tech is controlling your data, but people want, potentially more rights and more choice and control of their digital life. This is a consumer need. So what is Firefox doing? It's really providing a better choice by being an open source, non-for-profit opportunity. And out of this, we developed all the marketing stories, like Challenge the Default, Built for You, and so on. So just really roughly to understand, this one-pager helped us to align a lot of stakeholders and build that compass, create that decision framework. So, and the questions that came out of this is really for everyone is like, does this give users more choice? Everything that we did, so everybody looked through that kind of lens. Does this challenge big tech and the control of big tech? Does this advance open internet? If not, we're just not doing it. So think about the narrative and the compass as a filter system of what not to do and aligning stakeholders around the story. And then, with that space, and this is just a marketing slide, you should see the product slide, and so just by framing that and building that architecture, right, we had fun. The marketing team went, let's be a challenger. Let's do amazing things. Let's not just only talk about technology. Let's talk about the human angle around that. And really enabled us to do new things, like challenging Google by saying not all roads lead to Chrome, right? That's kind of like we showed up in front of Apple stores, handing out coffee. It says, challenge the default. You don't need to only have Safari on your phone. So the results really speak one language, which says like Europe grew for the first time in years. And why did this happen? Because we shifted from a tech into a human-centric perspective. So we really like looked much more, what's the human problem we're trying to solve? There's also European legislation, the Digital Market Act, the DMA, that you heard about, that brought choice screens to phones. And we've seen that people, when they're given a choice, people more and more preferred also Firefox, which was great. So we've seen significant mobile growth. And the team still executed. And I think that's what narrative architecture does. It is, in times of change and turmoil and people leaving and so on, the team also has that swim lane to continue working on it. So I left early this year, but there's a continuous navigation infrastructure that the team has built and keeps building and iterating. So where does this leave us? I think what I'm trying to tell you is like the architecture holds and can adapt when really everything moves. That's infrastructure. That's narrative infrastructure. That's an opportunity, right? Once you get the through line and you bring these three areas with you, is something that you build a system that potentially really outlasts you, right? And sounds hard, but it's like, there's a continuation around that. And I just brought this in somehow because it's like, it reinforced also for me personally, like, it's always that hard work that you bring into the table with lots of passion. But it's also that your narrative alignment is something that I'm very passionate about, but it's also being rewarded outside, right? So this is a GTM award. I've never expected to be having a face on, for a moment, on Times Square. And Richard King was also, but he made it there, so he was in front of it. I didn't, so he was a winner too. So, well, it was a proof that, and I think this is where, it's a really opportunity to be like, if you tell a cohesive story, not only you feel it, not only your consumers or your business partners feel it, but it's also that the world can see it, right? And that's, I think, what narrative architecture, you can see the brands who are working in that sphere. So we start with that Monday mess meeting, and that everybody's looking at you and like, what the hell? So maybe these are the three questions that I want to leave you when you go into these meetings next Monday. Ask the team, what is our story? And listen and document the gaps. I'm hearing this, this, and this. Does it really add up? And then start building and use that locate, own, compass, and swim opportunity. And then I would say, in this room, really own that role. Claim that role for you, which I would say, I'm here to build. I'm here as an architect. I'm here to bring that structure and lead with this new narrative.
Like this video? We've got loads more on demand. To access all previous event recordings, become a member. When you join, you also get access to more resources, templates, and inspiration from other leaders and PMMs. If you do want to catch us live, though, why not join us at our next event? Simply head to the link in the description to see where we're headed. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.